That was a dominant statement win by Penn State over Washington.
You are Locked On Nittany Lions, your daily podcast on the Penn State Nittany Lions. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And as always, thanks so much for making Locked On Nittany Lions your first listen and watch every single day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts, including YouTube. My name is Zach Seyko. I'm your host of the show, and this is an instant recap for Penn State versus Washington. Penn State wins 35-6. That was a statement win. That was a dominant victory. And just a few initial takeaways, reactions here, it was a complete team victory. Penn State got off to a fast start. We have not seen that from them really all season. West Virginia, they got into things pretty quickly after the first quarter. But even, outside of Kent State, all the other games, USC, Illinois, any of these other games, Penn State is off to a slow, sluggish start. 28-0, and they pulled out all of the gadgetry plays. So that's interesting to me, because where was this against Ohio State? The quarterback draws with Tyler Warren, Bo Prabula getting into the game pretty early, and then we didn't really see much of him down the stretch, but we saw a little bit more of him like later in the game when it wasn't consequential. But I'm talking about the consequential moments when it really mattered most. Bo Prabula, Tyler Warren, aggressive Wildcat packages to go ahead against Washington. We don't really need them. It's just kind of difficult to process because hindsight's 2020. It always will be. But where was that against Ohio State? I'm glad it worked against Washington. The argument can be made, hey, Penn State built up momentum and it worked because they needed it against Washington to build the lead, to build momentum. I don't know. I would have just rather have seen those kinds of plays against Ohio State because you needed them, not against Washington. I feel like Penn State could have had more of a vanilla game plan, if you will. But Andy Kotelnicki was more efficient, more effective again, and I think it helps when you don't have to play a top 5 defense. But the play calling was certainly better. The offense looked a lot more comfortable. Wide receivers and the offensive line looked better. Ohio State certainly gave them a tough test, but I think that reality check was necessary because Trey Wallace reemerged. 5 catches, 84 yards. What can you say about Tyler Warren? Tyler Warren's lumped in the pass catchers. Well, I want to talk about him individually. But to see Julian Fleming get his first touchdown as a Nittany Lion, to see Trey Wallace be utilized more, we still haven't heard from Amari Evans in quite some time. He did have the jet sweep end around, but he's been rather quiet in the passing game. Nicholas Singleton, Katron Allen, who we will talk about Singleton a little more here. But the pass catchers did better. This is a Washington, for what it's worth. They might not have looked like it this past night. This is kind of the late recap, instant recap here. But Washington has the second best overall pass defense when it comes to yards per game. That is a really talented secondary. And Penn State made quick, easy work of them. But they played complementary football. In pass protection, if you're going to give Drew Allard time, allow him to sit back in the pocket, go through his progressions, go through his reads, eventually the wide receivers are going to get open, and it helps when you have an overall playmaker like Tyler Warren to be able to do a lot of different things. The ground game also helps open up the passing game. The passing game helps open up the ground game. So Washington couldn't devote all of its resources to selling out for the ground game and vice versa. And the wide receivers being able to get open in one-on-one coverage against that Washington secondary is a good sign just down the stretch of the season. Okay, Ohio State's the measuring stick, but Penn State's still got to be able to win its other games even when the matchups aren't ideal. I went on the record saying that, hey, I think Washington's secondary can contain these wide receivers. And, to an extent, was it this all-around elite performance? No, because it didn't need to be. Penn State was able to rely on its ground game with Katron Allen because the offensive line was able to do what it needed to do. It won the battles up front. It gave the offensive line gave Drew Aller plenty of time, and then just allowed the ground game to get 4 or 5 chunk play yards. Corey Smith obviously had the 78-yard run to finish up the game and 95 yards in total, but that's in garbage time. But Katron Allen averaging nearly 5 yards per carry when Nicholas Singleton was in over 6 yards per carry. That's what Penn State needs to do offensively. Andy Kotelnicki is a run-first offensive coordinator, so all of that kind of settled in when they found rhythm with the ground game again. That's the point. Use the run to set up the pass. Let's talk about Nicholas Singleton briefly. Don't know what's wrong with him. He's clearly dealing with bumps and bruises. He re-aggravated something because what was interesting is, okay, he exited the game, but he did not come back. He did not come back in the game, and he wasn't, not only that, he exited for a good portion of the game, and then he wasn't on the sideline. He was not available post-game. Usually we get to talk to Singleton after the game as part of the player interviews. James Franklin didn't have an answer, and I don't think he's hiding anything. I think he was transparent to say, look, I don't know. In short, that's what James Franklin said. I don't know. Because the game had just finished. He addressed the team and then came in for his press conference. It's not surprising that he doesn't have a medical report for Singleton, who has not seen the trainer just yet, or James has not talked to the trainer just yet that was examining Singleton, but then he hasn't gone through the Sunday routine. They got to go through it, right? They practice and go through everything else. And James admitted that. He said, we're not going to know what's wrong with him until we go through practice and everything else. I like that. I like that Penn State made it to pivot away from Singleton, and I'll have more about Singleton, of course, throughout the week as we get updates and just the impact of his availability. But right now, Penn State was able to handle it, and they will be able to handle it down the remainder of the season, where Singleton is the most important is for that college football playoff game, that college football playoff run. This is a team that can make the run. And that's what I want to finish with here in this instant recap. Penn State had a statement victory. Penn State dominated a quality Washington team. That is objectively statistics and the eye test. I would argue that is a top 25, maybe even a top 20 defense overall in the country. The reason Washington is not as good as it should be, because that is a talented team. That's a well-coached team. But this was a team that was built through the transfer portal and is in the rebuild process. Jed Fish is an exceptional head coach with a guy like Brennan Carroll calling plays for them. It didn't seem like he's a good offensive coordinator, but he is. And then Steve Belichick, the son of Bill Belichick, is the defensive coordinator. Washington is disciplined. They're well coached. But Penn State, I think, is just that much more dominant. They are not far off from Ohio State. The only thing that matters are wins and losses. I completely understand that. But I think Penn State reminded all of us, at least they should have, that this is a college football playoff team. That, yes, they're in tier 2 of these teams, the elite teams, and Georgia used to be in this conversation, but now they have lost number 2 as we've seen. But Oregon, Ohio State, Texas lost to that Georgia team, right? There's a lot of anything can happen. And I think Penn State knows that. They know that they're going to go 11-1. They know that they're better than Washington, significantly better than Washington. We saw that on full display. Washington, down the stretch, Purdue, obviously, Minnesota, Maryland. This is an 11-1 football team that is set to host a college football playoff game in the first instance of this 12-team playoff. And they are that much better than the other teams on this schedule, where they might not be a favorite, or they should certainly be an underdog. Ohio State Part 2, if that happens, or I think of Oregon, Texas. You could probably lump Georgia in there as well. I don't think the second loss totally defines them. But then after that, I think Penn State's better than all the other teams that they would hypothetically face. So Penn State's kind of that 5th or 6th best team. Miami lost to Georgia Tech. And I was already saying that, hey, I think Penn State would be a favorite against Miami. And they lost to Georgia Tech. So that's the ultimate takeaway here from this game, is that Penn State should have reminded people that they are close to that group of teams. There's a gap, but they're close to Oregon, Texas, Ohio State. They got down inside the 5 twice. I know they didn't convert. At the end of the day, wins and losses matter. There's no moral victories in college football. But I'm trying to point out that Penn State was close, and I thought Washington was going to give them the game. I really did. I thought Washington was peaking at the right time. This is a talented team, a well-coached team, as I have pointed out. But Penn State did not have the hangover game. History tells us something completely different, that they lose this game. They lost this game this type of game in 2017. They lost this type of game in 2018. They lost this type of game in 2021. It's happened more often than not. And this time, this team broke that trend. They broke that trend. Not only did they win, they won convincingly. They dominated Washington. Washington is a quality football team. If they had won by 7 to 10 points, I'm really not sitting here with as much confidence, but I don't look at that Ohio State loss as the definition of this Penn State season. They are a top 10 team. They are so close to breaking into that tier. And I should have stood by what I said originally throughout the season, is the fact that this team is only going to get better. This is a new offensive and new defensive system. They need time to get adjusted. And I said, hey, the slow starts are going to go away. But you know what? The hangover game and the loss to Ohio State, that's going to affect them, and they're going to have to shake that off. But I was right to say that the slow starts are going to be a thing of the past as we get later into the season. So this isn't the exception anymore. And I know the competition is favorable, but do not expect a slow start against Purdue. Minnesota's the toughest remaining game. Do not expect a slow start there against Minnesota. And do not expect a slow start against Maryland. Penn State should be able to find its rhythm holistically like they did. They played complimentary football against Washington, 35-6. And defense was able to get the interception, chase down whether it was Williams, the backup quarterback, or the starter, Will Rogers. Washington had to bench its starting quarterback because the defense was so aggressive and just wreaking havoc the whole time. Abdul Carter by himself was a one-man wrecking ball. Abdul Carter had an incredible day. The last thing I do want to hit on, because I can't help myself, the whiteout game. The whiteout atmosphere is the best atmosphere in college football. And I am tired of people alluding that it's just not that important. There's a reason that Fox passed over it. There's a reason NBC decided to put it exclusively on Peacock, because they thought it was more worthwhile to sell streaming service subscriptions as opposed to putting it in the primetime main network. And I look around, I see the 110,000 fans, and I can't help but sit back and say, you passed on this? And NBC got lucky because Penn State decided to do its own whiteout energy game, the pseudo whiteout against Illinois. It was a disservice. The whiteout game is still, there was no build up to it. Throughout the week, it felt like I was forgetting just how incredible that atmosphere was. And then, quickly reminded being there that it's never going to disappoint. And what Penn State and the networks need to do is find a way to protect that game. Because I look at next season, Penn State versus Oregon, you got to find a way to make that the best opponent, the strongest opponent on Penn State's schedule. No ifs, ands, or buts. They need to find a way to work that out to make that a primetime 7:30, 8 o'clock kickoff and have that be the whiteout. Because that is how you continue to make college football even more special than it already is. That's going to do it for this instant recap. Be on the lookout for a live recap of Penn State versus Washington. This was a late one. This was a night game. And then we're going to talk about it, break it down further. Of course, talk about Purdue. Penn State wrestling gets started. Penn State men's basketball is getting into the groove of things. 100 points in back-to-back games. We got plenty to talk about here on Locked On Nittany Lions. I appreciate each and every one of you for checking out this instant recap. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments section. I would really appreciate a like, but more importantly, be a part of the conversation. This show is about getting you, the fan, and the spectator involved just as much as me bringing it to you as a podcast host. So thank you so much for checking it out. And if you're not already, become an everyday or subscribe to Locked On Nittany Lions on YouTube and wherever you get your podcast, because we're talking about it all. Penn State football, men's basketball, and wrestling. Thanks again for checking out this instant recap.